Um, and so if you're here, I'm watching comments. So as you have questions, um, I want to kind of make this as interactive as we can, but at the same time, I have a few ideas and a few thoughts, and some things written down that I want to talk about. So um, just let me know you're here. See, we have a few people connecting in, and again, feel free to post in the comments so that we can see what's going on, and I will do my best to try to get to your questions. Um, just in brief, of course, we all know what's been going on and what's been happening, and I really wasn't going to talk about it. It was the holidays. I felt like a lot of people had already said a number of things, and I know that for myself as a pastor, and as a pastor who has a beautiful and wonderful LGBT community, it's kind of clear where I stand, right? As a pastor, having marched in the Pride Parade, it's kind of clear where I stand in terms of talking about homosexuality or whether it's a sin, all of these kinds of things. But at the same time, um, as I started to see more and more comments and what people were saying, I recognized that there was time, there was another voice that I wasn't hearing, that I wasn't seeing, and there was something that we could still talk about. And so that's kind of just where I want to come from tonight. Now, first, let me say I consider myself an ally. I consider myself a straight ally to the community, and I've been that for a long time. Before I was a pastor, as a musician, I've been an ally as a musician and as an artist. I've been welcomed and embraced. I've performed in gay clubs at different events. Have always received love. Have always shown love. And also been willing to kind of push the conversation way before the whole down low thing was an issue and became reached national spotlight through Oprah and all of that fear that took place. I had a song that I performed for many years called "She Doesn't Know," which was really encouraging and written to people that I knew, to encourage them to come out and to let them know that there would be love and support, that you don't have to pretend, that you don't have to be a same gender loving man and marry a woman because of all of the things, whether in times past there was issues and fear about being able to be employed or losing your job, but in the church, this is still very much a normal practice. And I wrote that song to really speak to them, and again to just let them know that it's possible to be who you are, and that there's love. Um, so I've always considered myself an ally, and the love that I've given is the love that I've received. And so again, as I said a little earlier, this is not you're not going to get any sort of bashing from me. You're not going to get any so-called hate speech from me. You're also not going to get um, traditional theology from me. So I hope that some of my friends and folks that I've known and grown up with that were raised in the Pentecostal church with me. I hope you're watching at some point, and I hope that this will spark a perspective or some questions or some ideas for you all as well, because I think that it's time for us to have a total dialogue. Now, with that said, the other side of my background is as I consider myself an ally, but the other thing is that I was born and raised in the Pentecostal church, born and raised in the Holiness Church, born and raised in the oldest um, Pentecostal denomination here in the United States. And I am proud of that tradition. I'm proud of the church that I was raised in. Um, but I've evolved from that theology, and at the time when I was fully 100% in and embraced that way of believing, I believed the Bible 100%. I believed the Bible was the literal, inerrant, infallible Word of God. I feared the Bible. I believed that the Bible was a completely holy and sacred book that cannot be spoken against. I believed and feared God. I believed that even if I wasn't living it, that holiness was the right way. And it actually, that disconnect was the thing that showed me how much I needed God, and how bad I was, and how much I needed to be saved. Um, and so I share that part of my background and my story as well, because I think it's, as I consider myself an ally to the LGBT community and have proven that, I also have this wonderful background of having grown up in the Pentecostal church, grown up in the Pentecostal theology, and I know it well. I know it because it's all I knew for so long in my life. It's just something that's normal, and very natural. And I think that's important tonight, because if we're going to have a conversation, I think we have to understand all sides. And so I think we can't even really have a dialogue, or even begin to have some conversations that lead to healing, that lead to clarity, without understanding both sides. And so while I do not agree with the words of Kim Burrell, I do not agree with the sermon that she preached. I listened to the whole sermon. While I do not agree with her follow-up message, and which is an age-old, hate the sin, love the sinner. And I'm not really age-old, because I actually think that's sort of that was a newer approach as we got into the 90s. I feel like that became the sort of the way to talk. But again, while I don't agree with her words, I understand them. I understand them because I understand the world that she lives in, and I understand her theology. Similarly, while I don't agree with the words from Pastor Shirley Caesar last night, I understand them because I understand her theology. I understand her tradition. And because I understand her tradition, then we can actually have a dialogue. And so the reason why I said now what, why I called this Now What, Kim Burrell, Homosexuality and the Black Church. The reason why I asked the question now what is, okay, as soon as I heard the words from Kim, which I think it was right before New Year's Eve, it was late that night, and my heart sank, and I said, oh no, this is not going to be good, right? And she was scheduled to be on Ellen. I knew that wasn't going to happen. And I saw her apology in real time, and I was like, oh no, this is still not going to be good. But she hasn't been on Ellen. She's now lost her radio show. And I'm sure there may be some additional fallout. But my question is, now what? Like, is that a victory? Because I don't think it is. I don't really think it's a victory because, and I was commenting on this on a conversation on Facebook earlier today, because I think that there's something that we don't understand, or we need to understand, about the position that Kim Burrell has taken. And again, I think this is why we have to understand where she's coming from. She's coming from a perspective that the Bible is right. And when I say the Bible is right, what I mean is that the literal reading and interpretation, and her specific interpretation, unquestioned interpretation of the Bible, is absolutely right. And so it's also then believed that as a preacher, as a teacher, and we could even say, when you feel that you're speaking prophetically, and as the pastor of the church, she was speaking to her congregation in her church. She believes wholeheartedly that what she was speaking was words of love and warning. in the same way that it would be loving for me to tell a child in a word of warning not to touch a hot stove. From her perspective, that's what she was speaking. That's what she was teaching. But unfortunately, it's just founded in some things that need to be critically looked at. And so what I hope we can do tonight, and to the extent that there are questions, I hope that we can even begin to look at, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? Because I think that's incredibly important. What I've heard, and again, I have friends from all different theological perspectives, and for my friends who are pastors, bishops, and elders, they went to Kim Burrell's message and found no problem with it. They said, well, all I heard was she preached about sin, and sin is still wrong, right? I've even heard those who are in the LGBT community, or those who are not speaking words of hate against the gay community, that, well, why are you just singling out one sin and not talking about gluttony? Why aren't you talking about all these other things? And so even that argument for me still keeps us in the realm of talking about homosexuality as sin. And I think that the more radical point of view, radical to some, but really from my perspective, based on my scholarship and based on those that I've studied, those that I look up to, my heroes like Dr. James Forbes, my heroes like Peter Gomes, and other wonderful scholars, this idea about homosexuality, we have to just look at the deep roots of misunderstanding that have occurred in order to get us to this place. And so, to me, unless we're having a conversation to say, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk tonight, homosexuality is not a sin. I don't think that's a radical statement, right? Now, why? Well, the bulk of what we get in terms of viewing homosexuality as a sin has so much to do with the First Testament or the Old Testament, right? And there are two key things there. Now, first we have in the book of Leviticus, where we have that reading in Leviticus that a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination, right? And of course, that word is the word that's been used. It's an abomination. It's a stench to God's nostrils. The word that Kim Burrell used, she used the word perversion, right? And first, we have to just look at that word abomination. And this is where we get into biblical scholarship, right? That, personal study and reading the Bible on your own is one thing. Biblical scholarship is a different thing. And unfortunately, most Christians, including myself until I received training, cannot even begin to understand how to really look at scripture and understand what's going on. So one of the things is that word abomination, as it appears in the Old Testament or the First Testament, there are actually 4 different distinct Hebrew words that are translated into English as abomination. Now, that's just incredibly important to look at in and of itself, right? Because when we start to talk about the nuances of translation, you can't translate 4 different words into one word and it mean the same thing. If a language, if the beautiful Hebrew language has 4 words to express something, that would indicate to us that then each word has a different nuance, right? But the word, I'm just going to my notes here, the word toiba, and toiba is the word that is translated in that passage where we have man lying with a woman, and it's abomination. A man lying with a man as with a woman, it's an abomination, right? That word toiba, when we really start to dig into the definition of it, it's not sin. It's not even a moral judgment as we've been led to think about it. What it really is more akin to would be taboo. And that's a different inference. It's a completely different inference, right? Because then all of a sudden, if it's taboo, even let's just say, if it's taboo for a man to lie with a man, it's taboo for a woman to lie with a woman. Well, we have no lake of fire. We have no, judgment coming down from God because that happened, right? But then we have to dig deeper into the history and the culture and the context of what was going on, and where did these codes come from? Because that word taboo, and again, the Hebrew word is toiba, but that word that's translated into English as abomination, what we see is that same word as the word that was used when it came to prostitution. It's the same word that was used when it also came to the dietary restrictions, which many of us are familiar with. Shellfish, eating shellfish being one of those things, right? And what we find is that when we look at the history and the culture, and I promise I will also post some links for some books to offer some more context for everyone. But what we find is that we have to understand what was going on with the Hebrew people as they were brought into according to the story, the land that God gave them. But of course, it was land that people already lived in. And so what we must understand, we must separate even the Exodus story and the Moses story from its epic tall tale context, right? Which is, we have this grand story that looks like the Charlton Heston movie. But what we find is that based on the very limited history that's available, because there is no record of the Hebrew people ever being in Egypt or building the pyramids. There's one group of people called the Apiru people, Apiru, who may be the historical Hebrew people that came out of Egypt. If they are, what we know is that they were a small band of people, a small group of people, and they crossed through not the Red Sea, but the Reed Sea, Reed, in other words, a sea of reeds, into a new land that was already inhabited by other people. And so what we must understand is that this small community, this small band of people who in truth were really considered a cult, and that's not in a negative sense, that's in the truest sense of that word. That this cult, this band of people, this Hebrew people moved into the land, and they were trying to establish their own identity. Now, based on that, there were a set of codes, there were a set of rules, there were a set of laws that they needed to create in order to protect their community. Now, again, this is according to my study, according to my scholarship, and according to Old Testament scholars. That what we understand is what was happening with that community is it was deemed not a sin, but taboo within the community for men to lie with men as with a woman, or women to lie with women, because this small group of people, they actually wanted to make sure that procreation was happening within the community so that their community would grow and expand, because they were a small community and did not want to be overtaken by the other groups that they were also interacting with. This is also then where the sense of separation or difference showed up in the rite, R-I-T-E, of circumcision. So this is why it was considered taboo, not a sin, not a judgment from God, right? But what happened is that when we look at the how the story was told and retold and told and retold and written and rewritten and then redacted, because what we must understand is that we don't even, the earliest writings that we can consider, that we know of after the oral tradition, the writings began during the time of King David, right? So for those of you who know the biblical history, when you consider that all of this history that had taken place, all of these events that had taken place, they didn't even start writing them down until the time of King David. And from there on, they were constantly written and rewritten and changed based on who were the owners of the story. If for those of you who remember the series we did last year in Reimagine the Bible, and the first message I did is what's in your Bible. We focused on the Old Testament, and I talked about the source theory, right? That we actually have in the Old Testament, it's written from 4 different perspectives: the Yahwist, the Elohist, the the Deuteronomist and the priestly. And so you have these four different voices that don't always agree. Because we have these four different voices, that's why we have two versions of the Noah flood story. Because we have four different voices, this is why we have two versions of the creation story. I talk about it often. It's right there in your Bible, right? The first chapter of Genesis has God creating humankind in its image, likeness and image, and it was all good. Humankind, not Adam and Eve. The order in the creation is different because humankind is created after the animals in that first story. In the second story, we know the second story, the Adam and Eve story, which is the more pervasive and more widely distributed story. We know that the animals are created after Adam because God asked Adam, or told Adam, that he could name the animals. And of course, for those who have been listening to me and listening to us at CSC for some time, you know that then the Adam and Eve story is not a literal story. It's a symbolic story. It's an allegorical story. And so as we get into these ideas, we understand that we have to begin to look at this text called the Bible differently. Now, even that, we use this word Bible like we're talking about one book. If I say Roots by Alex Haley, we know that from cover to cover, we're reading the words of Alex Haley. It's one unified story. The Bible is not unified, right? I hope that's not controversial, but the Bible is comprised of 66 books of different voices, and many voices were left out, based on certain political agendas. That's not radical. I'm not trying to get into a conspiracy theory because it's not about a conspiracy theory. But what's interesting to me, and I talk about this often, is that many of the books that were burned so that they could not be canonized have been rediscovered. They were rediscovered in the 1940s. And this begins to open up and shift and change the conversation. The Dead Sea Scrolls gives us a different perspective on the Psalms. The scrolls that come out of the Qumran cave that give us the Gospel of Thomas gives us a different perspective on the Gospels. And I bring that up to say that I don't criticize, I will never speak ill, I will never call someone ignorant or dumb for not understanding many of the things that I'm talking about, because I recognize that a lot of this is still new. When we recognize that as these texts were just being unearthed in the 1940s, and then we recognize the beautiful process that had to take place in order to get all the fragments together to be able to read them, and then the beautiful process of scholars and very knowledgeable people to then interpret those fragments and then begin to publish based on them. And so, it's not even until the 1980s really that we start to get the first books that are even published for us to begin to wrap our minds around these beautiful Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas, or the additional the Gospel of Paul and the infancy Gospels, all of these wonderful texts that are rich. The Essene Gospel of Peace, where in the Essene Gospel of Peace, we find the very words that are attributed to Paul about love. Love is patient, love is kind. These words were in the mouth of Jesus before they were in the mouth of Paul. And so, again, we have this information now, but unfortunately, because of tradition, right, we have those like Kim Burrell, we have those like Pastor Shirley Caesar, who are simply not exposed to this information. And for me, what I know to be true, A Course in Miracles teaches us that every act of fear is a call for help or a call for love. And when I hear words like the words that were shared by Kim Burrell, it opens my heart. It opens my heart to not only to love her just in the sense that she's my sister, but to recognize that there's something that she doesn't know. Because I believe if she knew, and I believe if she was willing to take the time to open up her heart and mind, to begin to look at the Bible differently, not to throw away the Bible. The Bible is not a bad thing. But for me, in seminary, I was trained under liberation theology. We use the Bible as a tool for liberation. We do not use the Bible as a tool, as a hammer to beat people up. And let's just talk about that for a second, because it is very difficult to witness African Americans using the Bible as a tool of oppression, right? Now, some people would say, oh, well, it's not the same, right? Well, when slavery was legal in this country, the whole conversation of slavery was an equally spiritual conversation. There was one side theologically that felt and believed that not only does God justify slavery, because we have texts in the Bible like slave, obey your masters. And so if God wrote those words, why would God be against slavery, right? I mean, this is if the Bible is literally written by God, right? And infallible and inerrant. Well, then we also had those who went further and interpreted scripture to say not only that Africans and enslaved Africans were subhuman, but that they didn't have souls, right? And that they were less than white people, period. And that was a theological, spiritual understanding. That wasn't, it wasn't just they were racist. They believed based on what their Bible told them, which hasn't changed, same words, right? But further, really, their interpretation of scripture, they believed that they were justified in what they were doing. But beautifully, right? We have, we have the abolitionists, we have the Quakers, we have particularly and specifically the Methodist Church. Shout out to the Methodist Church, right? That we had those powerful brothers who understood that slavery was not of God, right? But how did they understand that? Right? How did they understand that? There had to be some deeper level of searching that took them beyond the Bible, but also took them beyond the literal reading of the Bible. Similarly, when we look at even, for myself, my ancestors who were enslaved Africans, they believed something about themselves. They believed that God still loved them. They believed that God still honored them. They saw themselves in the Exodus story, that God is a God of the oppressed, that God is a liberator, even though the very Bible that was being read to them was saying something different. And so it always boggles my mind, often it does, that African American people, and as the ancestors of Africans, enslaved Africans, we understand that our ancestors had an imagination that allowed them to understand something about God that was beyond the literal reading of the text. Where is that now? Because that's what's required, right? I don't believe that there's something. I don't believe that there's something unique or some unique ability that I have in my perspective that Kim Burrell doesn't have. I don't believe that there's something unique that I have in my perspective that Pastor Shirley Caesar or others don't have. But what I do know is that it requires us to call on our imagination and recognize that God is bigger than Genesis to Revelation. That's just true, right? And again, I don't know, maybe some things that I'm sharing are radical tonight. I don't know. And as this is shared out in many different communities, it may be. But if God is God, God would have to be bigger than a set of books, would have to be bigger than a finite revelation based on a finite perspective. Think about how the world was viewed from the perspective of those who wrote the Bible. They can't even conceive of the world that we live in, right? How can someone who, we have cell phones and satellites and we've been to space and to the moon and all of these things, we have to recognize their limitation in being able to speak to our world, which means that we have to then, I always say, we have to check our God concept. And really what we have to do is then expand our God concept. And what's beautiful is biblical scholarship can allow us to do that. So many people, I think, are fearful of that, right? Because as you start to ask questions, you feel like, oh, well, where is it going to take me? Where is it going to lead me? Am I going to lose my faith? But what I've come to know and understand, and having been on the other side of it, is that come through the valley and come out whole again, as I wrote in my song. What I've come to understand is that my concept of God has grown. My relationship with God is bigger, more precious, and more beautiful than it's ever been. Now, I just want to check. I see there's some comments coming in. Um, uh, Thank you all for just being here and commenting. This is awesome. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to just pop it in. So good to see folks here. I got some surprises, some folks I didn't expect to see here tonight, but it's beautiful. Um, Let me go back. Because as we were talking about, because I want to just make sure we cover the specifics around homosexuality as a sin, right? So we talked about Leviticus, and again, this idea, if you look at there are 4 different Hebrew words. The words specifically in Leviticus, toiba, the better translation of that word, as you dig into it, is taboo. And again, that's just a different conversation. And then we understand why it was called taboo for that community, right? For that community and that community alone. And that's a very important. It was not a blanket declaration for all human beings throughout time. They didn't even have a sense of how many human beings were on the planet. Right? At the time that those codes were developed, they didn't know that South America existed. They didn't know that Mexico existed. Were those words for the Aztecs? No. Were those words for the Mayans? No. Right? So again, if we just bring our minds, again, we have more information now. We bring our minds to it. We understand that was written in that time for that community and does not speak to now. But then we have the other thing that's going on right now. So then we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And unfortunately, because of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we have the word sodomy, and sodomites comes from that. And of course, that is a really ugly term, right? Because it's ugly in the way that it's used. Because I think if we use sodomy in understanding what happened, what was really happening in the story, then let's use it in that way. But to use it to talk about an act between 2 people who love each other, it's a misuse of the word. So what we know in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, essentially there was this incredibly wicked place, according to the writer of the story. We always have to be mindful of this, right? Just as Charles Dickens starts, A Tale of Two Cities with, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's his critique. That's his perspective on what was happening. And then he's framing our perspective by writing, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Similarly, as the writer is writing the story about Sodom and Gomorrah, the writer is framing his perspective about this place. That might not have been the only perspective, but it's this writer's perspective, and this is what we're being given. So we're already being led into an interpretation, but we have to bring, as what my Professor Cole always says, a hermeneutic of suspicion. We have to keep our eye open. We have to side-eye the text and understand who was writing, who's telling us that this was a wicked town. But nevertheless, this is how we're given the story. And we know that, there were the angels were sent, and essentially there were some men who wanted to rape the angels and have sex with them. And so this is a representation of just how, quote unquote, depraved, and to use the word that was used by Kim Burrell, perverted this particular town and city was. Now, what we must understand, looking at from a historical and a cultural context, we have to understand that when those men wanted to rape the angels, what that was about power. And it was pointing to a practice that took place during that time, and unfortunately takes place in our time today. Our own military unfortunately, the U.S. military has done some of the same things, where when you conquer a village, you conquer a town, you conquer a space, it's well documented practice that the men would rape the men. The men would have sex with men as a way to show power and control and to dehumanize them. Now, again, unfortunately, if you all remember some time back now with the Abu Ghraib tortures by our own U.S. military, we find the very same thing, that in addition to torturing, they were also raping many of the so-called terrorists. This is something that we see over and over again. The proper word for that is sodomy. But that has nothing to do with a man who loves a man and a woman who loves a woman. It has nothing to do with that intimate, loving relationship. And so, again, unfortunately, over time, through misinterpretation, this is where we've come to. And so we have those two, those two big pieces there from the Old Testament. We'll talk about New Testament in a second because we got to deal with Paul, right? Because Paul talks about it as well. But then we're going to get into Greek culture in a second. Oh, and I'm looking at this question, Blair. This is a great question. How do we combat the charge of blasphemy that comes with attempting to engage conversation about the Bible is not infallible? Well, really, I think really this is where your own study and understanding. I'm taking these words from my Old Testament and New Testament professor, based on my scholarship. ... What you'll find is that the more that you study and from an academic perspective, none of what I'm saying is new. None of what I'm saying is radical. But unfortunately, just as I said in the 1940s, how this information, even from the texts outside of the Bible that were considered lost and that were thought to be burned and permanently gone, just as these things, have been unearthed and it's still taking time to enter mainstream culture. So this is the same way. And I have a wonderful example for that to understand just how human beings work. And again, I think why and how we have to do our best to be loving with Kim Burrell and try to be the example. I hope she sees this. I would love to be someone to have a dialogue with her because I understand her perspective. I understand her world. I understand where she's coming from. And as I said, I've crossed through that valley and I've come out on the other side. I know that that's one of the big parts of my ministry. It's one of the things that Pastor Yolanda and I talk about all the time, that we know that we're here and Celebration Spiritual Center is here for many who have left the traditional church, who have left a traditional theology and are seeking a progressive theology. But you need somebody to hold your hand to move through this because there are a lot of questions and there's a whole lot to unlearn, right? And so we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? But then there's also the New Testament, right? And again, this is a cultural thing. What we see from Paul, when Paul speaks about homosexual activity, or when Paul is speaking about men lying with men, we have to look at who he was speaking to. We have to look at the world that he was in, because now we're talking about the Greco-Roman world. And what we find is that as we look into the translation and we go back to the Greek, we find that the word that he's using when he's speaking about men being with men, it's a term called pederasty, Pederasty. And pederasty was a practice. It was a common practice in the Greco-Roman world where men would take young boys as apprentices. And they would take them as apprentices to teach them a trade, but they would also use them for sex. This is even where we get into the root when we think about the root of a word like pedophile. This is what pederasty was, and this is what Paul was speaking out against. Now, I think all of us can agree that pederasty is not a good thing, right? We all would agree that a grown man taking a young boy and having sex with a minor is a problem. We've seen that in the Catholic Church. It's a problem. We've seen that in the Church of God in Christ, although it's not talked about as prevalently because there was so much in the news about the Catholic Church and all of the lawsuits. There equally have been many lawsuits and millions of dollars paid in settlements, particularly within the Church of God in Christ, from similar controversies and similar incidents. And so one of the things that's happened within the Pentecostal church, I think particularly, is we've seen that practice. We've seen the practice, again, which is not good, right? And we're all clear about that, of grown men having sex with young, impressionable young men, boys, minors. That is illegal. It's always been illegal. It's illegal if it's a grown woman with a young boy, right? But this has nothing to do with the sexuality of it in terms of it being a man with a man or a woman with a woman. Pedophilia, pederasty is wrong, right? And so we just got to be clear about that. But then that's what was being spoken about. And again, unfortunately, I think because these types of incidents have taken place, and again, unfortunately, so much that I personally know about within the Pentecostal church, this is then what even fuels, and on a level, what I believe, as I hear Kim Burrell's words, I hear some hurt in her words, right? I hear some personal stories in her words, right? And I know that as a pastor, at the very least, she's been exposed to the what happens to families with this kind of stuff. What happens to people who don't get the proper therapy and treatment, right? PTSD is real, and it leads to all other kinds of issues. But just as if I, as a young man, was raped by an older woman, I would not say, oh no, I'm heterosexual now because a woman raped me when I was a child. Similarly, if it was a man that violated me or molested me, and yet I am a same gender loving man, it wasn't because of the molestation. It wasn't because of that incident. And we got to separate the two, because again, the logic doesn't work, because it would have to work on both hands, right? And it doesn't. And so that's what Paul was talking about. I think it's incredibly important for us to understand that. And so for these reasons, this is why I say, clearly, based on my scholarship and based on my study of the Bible, based on the historical, the cultural, the critical textual analysis of the words that we have in the Bible, we can be clear and just know that homosexuality isn't a sin, right? Now, what's interesting, and I said I wanted to bring this up. I was watching a video yesterday. Nutrition Facts is a website that I love, and they highlight research based on healthy eating, and are really advocates of a plant-based diet and a vegan diet. But Dr. Greger offered a perspective that I think is very apropos to where we are now, because while what I'm sharing I don't feel is new, it still is new because it's not mainstream. It's not widely known. And what Dr. Greger talked about, he's an advocate for healthy eating. He's an advocate for plant-based eating, and he's sharing study after study on a daily basis that shows that if we eat plants, we won't get cancer. If we eat plants, we won't get diabetes. If we, eat plants, all of these things that we consider common illnesses wouldn't happen. And it's proven. There are people on the planet that, because they eat differently, communities in Africa and in China, that because they eat differently, cancer is not a norm in their communities, right? Diabetes is not a norm in their community. And so while these studies are available, it's not widespread. It's not mainstream, and we don't know about it. And of course, there are corporate interests that keep that at bay. And what he compared it to was smoking, because for me, I'm 40 years old, and it's not that long ago. I can remember being a child on a plane and there being a smoking section on the plane. That seems absurd to me now, right? Because we understand what secondhand smoke is. There's no way you can really filter out all of the toxins out of a closed airplane. I remember back in the day when there was a smoking section in the restaurant, but the restaurant still smelled like smoke. And you could also be in the non-smoking section, but you were right next to the smoking section, and so smoke was still coming over into your area. It wasn't that long ago that there wasn't a ban as there is in New York on smoking in public places. That going to clubs, for me as a musician and as an artist, I would do shows in clubs all the time, and shout out, I'm sure y'all remember, you go to a club and your clothes would smell like smoke. You come out of the club, that was normal, right? But yet we had all this we had at that point already had the Surgeon General's warning. But what he shares is that there had been over 7,000 credible studies that proved that smoking caused cancer, that proved that, smoking, by smoking, you're putting yourself at incredible risk. But all the while that these studies were not being paid attention to, what was the tobacco industry doing? Well, they were just marketing their cigarettes as the healthy cigarette. Don't smoke that cigarette, but smoke this one. This one is a healthy cigarette. The filters were added to cigarettes. So, it has a filter, so you won't die. You won't get cancer. Meanwhile, year after year, more and more people were developing cancer and were dying. And it wasn't until there were 7,000 credible studies that in the 60s, the first Surgeon General warning came about. Now, it seems logical. Did we need 7,000 studies that prove that smoking kills until there was some national statement about it from the Surgeon General? Like, couldn't that have happened at 4,000, 1,000, after the first 500 studies, after the first 100 studies? But it's so interesting to me because it speaks to human nature and sometimes our unwillingness to change, but also the fear. In this case, it was tied to money, right? In this case, it was tied to, the tobacco industry being very, very powerful. And it's even interesting when you think about the fact that the tobacco industry is created on the backs of slavery, which was justified, as we talked about, from this spiritual perspective. There was a lot of momentum there. And so similarly, without putting any blame on any one particular person or institution, I recognize that there is a similar amount of momentum. And so this is why I know it's important for me as a minister to have dialogues like this tonight, to put this information out there, because I recognize that, when we know better, we do better, right? And the reason why Kim Burrell went on Facebook, I believe, to apologize and to say that I wasn't talking about anybody in particular, I was talking about, as she said, SIN, because that's what she knows. If she had the willingness, because I don't know if she has the willingness, but also if she had been exposed to this information, even exposed to the extent, for those, and I know we have some that are here who were born and raised in the Pentecostal tradition, that, asking questions, you couldn't ask questions, right? And then to a certain extent, if you ask too many questions, then you could be called of the devil, and there might be a demon in you, and they might try to exorcise that demon out of you for asking questions, right? And so when you're raised under that thought of not asking questions, you don't even think to question the information that you've been given. Like that doesn't happen. That really doesn't happen. And so I recognize that she doesn't know what she doesn't know. She doesn't know and does not see the words that she shared as hateful. But this is why I say that, again, it takes us back to every act of fear is a call for love. She's acting from a fearful place, right? She's in fear of the devil. She believes that homosexuality is a spirit, is a demon, right? Something that you're supposed to be afraid of. But unfortunately, I've seen so many people that are close to me who went to be exorcised of this homosexual demon and spirit, and they thought they were exorcised of it, but it didn't work. Why? Because it's who they are. They were born this way, right? I've watched so many people that I care about, fall out at the altar wanting to get rid of this thing because they've been told that there's something wrong with them, right? And of course, I know many people who have attempted to commit suicide for this reason, because we're raised to love God. We're raised to honor God. We're raised to wanting God to be pleased with us, right? I want God to be pleased with me. And to be told that this thing that feels 100% natural, that you're clear that I was born this way, just as I was born with this beautiful brown skin. And God doesn't like that, and this is why people are trying to kill themselves, right? Alcoholics aren't trying to kill themselves because God doesn't like alcoholism, supposedly, right? You think about all these other so-called sins and so-called bad things. Like people aren't generally trying to kill themselves because they're living lives of sin and God is not happy with it. But what we're finding is that, what recourse do you have when you're born a certain way and you're being told by someone that you love and you want the love of this thing, God, your creator, doesn't love you as you naturally are? This is why so many people are committing suicide. And so I say to my LGBT family, this is so important. There are those that will hear this message tonight and are still in the four walls of tradition for a lot of different reasons. But I want you to know that there are places, I've said it before, but there are churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, spiritual centers that will love and affirm you, right? Not just Celebration Spiritual Center. We have beautiful people like Bishop Yvette Flunder, right? And her ministry and churches. Or if you want to go and look at the history of Carl Bean, Archbishop Carl Bean now. But there's a rich history of affirming ministries, of openly out loud and proud ministries that love God and teach you your worthiness and teach you the Bible from this perspective, right? There are New Thought spiritual centers like Celebration Spiritual Center, which a New Thought has always been embracing of the LGBT community, and New Thought is not squeaky clean. Okay, New Thought has had their issues, and we know that history with segregation in the Unity Church, right? But there are New Thought churches, there are UCC churches, right? And so you don't have to continue to go to churches that don't affirm you. You don't have to continue to go to churches that take your money, but then preach down to you and preach about you and make you feel anything less than a child of God. The truth is that each and every one of us have been created in the likeness and image of our Creator. We were created perfect, whole, and complete. Perfect, whole, and complete. The Adam and Eve story is a story. It's a symbolic story. It's a symbolic story that teaches us what happens when we believe that something is wrong with us. I cannot say it enough. If you look at the story, God asks a question: who told you you were naked? It was because Adam and Eve, which is an aspect within us, it represents us, both the male and female. When we believe that there is something wrong with us, that is when we are banished out of the garden. That is when we are banished out of prosperity. That is when we are banished out of the kingdom. That is when we are banished out of abundance. But it is because of a thought that we're thinking, not because of a thought that God is thinking, right? And so when we bring our minds back to our worthiness, when we bring our minds back to we are holy as God is holy because we contain the DNA of our Creator, when we bring our minds back to that truth and that reality, we come back into the garden. We come back into the garden. And so I encourage all of us, everyone, those who are allies like myself, those who are members of the LGBT community, to find the best way for you to remain in the place and space of love. Because what I know to be true, I love what Abraham Hicks says here, that a belief is simply a thought we keep thinking. That's all. And so Kim Burrell and other pastors and other people have been thinking a thought for a long time, and it's a belief. But we can change our thought. That's the beauty and the message of New Thought. We can think a new thought at any time. That's the beautiful power that we've been given, the power of mind. And so as we keep our hearts open, as we recognize that every attack is really a call for love, as we keep in mind that every act of fear, all of these words are really a call for love, because if they knew better, they would do better. There's information they just don't have, right? There's just information they don't have. Then we open the space for dialogue. We keep the space open for change, because there were things that I believed many years ago that, no, I don't think I've ever subscribed to the specific words that Kim Burrell shared, but I believed in the underlying ideas, right? I had the fear of demons. I was talking about a story today where I remember hearing a message from a preacher who said that, any secular music you have in your home, you're inviting demons and spirits into your home. And so my sister and I went and threw away all of our tapes. There's like stuff that I can never find again that I threw away because I was so scared and wanted to please God so much. I believed that songs that I was listening to, I was inviting the devil in, and I was going to be overtaken by spirits, right? These are the kinds of spooky and superstitious beliefs that exist. And so I know that if I was able to overcome and change and move through these kinds of ideas, I absolutely know that Kim Burrell has that same opportunity, possibility to do the same. There are many parents of gay boys and girls who did not have to really think about this conversation until it was their child. And then that's what took them to scripture. Then that's what took them to study. And now they see differently. And so I know there are hundreds, if not even thousands of people who changed that belief, the thought that they were thinking previously, and have moved into a newer understanding, have moved into a progressive understanding, have moved into a more powerful understanding, a more loving understanding. And so let's keep our hearts open to know that even as Kim Burrell is preaching what she believes is right, preaching what she believes is loving, preaching what she believes is good, there is still room for her to expand her theology. There is still room for her to grow her theology. And ultimately, there is still room for her to come to understand God in a way that is much bigger, that is much more expansive, but most importantly, is much more loving than she could ever imagine. Because when we truly understand that God is love, we understand that then there is no judgment. There's no judgment in love. Love only allows. And so that is why even God doesn't hold judgment against Kim Burrell, right? But God, in its loving nature and in its loving self, has enough room, enough expansive room within itself to allow Kim Burrell to come to a new understanding. And so it is my prayer that though there are those that are closer to her, there are those that are within reach that can speak to her. It is my desire, it is my hope that through this experience, her willingness has been increased, has been open, so that she can hear a new perspective, because it will liberate her. Because that's what this is for. It liberates her. All of my LGBT people, y'all are good, right? Whatever Kim Burrell thinks about you, right, or Kim Burrell putting you in hell or not, is not changing your life. It's not paying your bills. It's not taking you to and from work. Y'all are good regardless of what her opinion is. But ultimately, what we know is that as an incredibly talented and creative being, just as we all are, that there is the capacity and possibility for her to be able to exemplify love in a way that she will be able to reach people and open up hearts that I wouldn't reach, right? Because there are people that don't want to hear me. but there are people that would want to hear her. I'm just going to check in on the comments, and see if we have any other questions. But I really appreciate you all, for being here tonight. This is really beautiful. This is really beautiful. Um, so many wonderful comments. Um, are there any questions? Oh, it's so good to see so many people. Shout out to my boy L. You got the whole office listening. I love it. Um, Carly, Mama Paulo, CSC family, Andrene, L. I saw you here earlier. Angela, uh, Naya. So good to see you all. Rabia, so good to see you all. Um, I absolutely appreciate you all just for taking the time. This is going to be saved. It's going to be on the page, so feel free to share it. We're also going to post it on YouTube, so just so we can keep the conversation going, and we might do something more, do something similar. I encourage you, if you haven't seen the series, we did two series last year. No, it's last year. Reimagine the Bible, Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1, we focused on the Old Testament. Part 2, we focused on the New Testament. We're going to do a new Reimagine the Bible series this year. It'll either be on Job or on the Psalms. I haven't decided yet. Leaning towards Job, leaning towards Job. But I love you all. And I look forward to sharing more with you very soon. All right. Be well.